Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today I will be sharing with you some of the similarities between the Gospels of Luke and John. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, there are 4 Gospels. 3 of them are called Synoptic Gospels. These are Mark, Matthew, and Luke. These 3 follow a very similar chronological order. They share a number of different miracle stories and teachings, and so that's why they are called synoptic. While the Gospel of John is not synoptic, it differs from the other 3 in a number of ways. Now, all 4 Gospels certainly agree on a lot more than they disagree on, but even more so, Luke and John agree. They share a number of details, some that are quite insignificant, some that are of more importance. And so in today's video, I will be sharing with you 16 similarities between the Gospels of Luke and John. The first parallel is probably the most minuscule, the smallest detail, and most insignificant of any that I will share with you. It is that in the garden, when Jesus was arrested, and one of his followers took a sword and cut off the ear of one of the high priest's servants, only Luke and John mention that it was his right ear that was cut off. Luke says one of them struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. John, which identifies the follower who cut off the ear as Simon Peter, says, "Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear," and then goes on to say that the slave's name was Malchus. Again, a very minor detail, but interesting that Luke and John happen to share this detail, and not Matthew and Mark. A second detail that Luke and John share is that they both mention characters named Mary and Martha, who are sisters. Mary and Martha of Bethany. They also both mention a character named Lazarus, although in Luke, this is referring to the poor man in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man dies and ends up in hell, while Lazarus, the poor man, ends up in heaven with Abraham. In John, however, Lazarus is the brother of Mary and Martha, and he is the one who Jesus rises from the dead, according to John chapter 11. So we have the sisters, Mary and Martha, and a man named Lazarus. Names that are found only in Luke and John. Another interesting little tidbit that Luke and John share also relates to Mary and Martha. Specifically that Martha is portrayed as more active than her sister Mary. In Luke, Martha is preparing for a meal for Jesus and his followers, while Mary sits at his feet and listens to his teachings. And Martha complains about this to Jesus, asking him to tell her sister to help prepare the meal. And Jesus corrects her, saying that it is more important to worry about him than anything else. Likewise, Martha is more active in the Gospel of John. When Jesus is coming to Bethany after Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, has died, before he even comes into the city, Martha rushes out to where Jesus is, while Mary stays inside and waits until she has been called by Jesus. Not only are Luke and John unique in having sisters, Mary and Martha, in their Gospels, but these sisters also share certain traits. Another detail shared by both is the mention of Annas, the high priest. Now in Luke, he's mentioned along with Tiberius Caesar and Pontius Pilate and various other rulers and important people of the time to put into context the timing of the ministry of John the Baptist. In the Gospel of John, Annas plays a role in the passion of Jesus because the crowds who arrest him bring him to Annas first, and then after this, Annas sends Jesus off to Caiaphas. Annas is not mentioned at all by Matthew or Mark. Luke and John also share in mentioning that Peter had a miraculous catch of fish. Now, in Luke, this occurs at the beginning of his ministry, around the time that Simon Peter is called to be an apostle, while in John, it happens at the very end of the gospel after Jesus has been raised from the dead. In both incidents, Jesus instructs Peter to put his net on the other side of the boat, and when Peter does this, he catches a great number of fish. In Luke, it is said that 2 boats together were not enough to take in all of the fish, and in John, it is mentioned that 153 large fish were caught. Luke and John are also the only 2 Gospels to mention the 12 apostles receiving the Holy Spirit. Now, Luke wrote both the Gospel of Luke and Acts, and in Acts he describes in detail the first Pentecost, where the 12 and several other followers received the Holy Spirit. But he does allude to this in the Gospel of Luke, talking about the promise of the Father coming to the apostles while they are still in Jerusalem. And that promise refers to the gift of the Holy Spirit. In the Gospel of John, Jesus also talks about that his Father will send a helper, an advocate, which is called the Paraclete. And then in John chapter 20, the resurrected Jesus breathes on the 12 and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And so the gift of the Holy Spirit is central to both the Gospels of Luke and John. Another parallel is that in both Luke and John, some Jewish leaders come to Jesus and ask him whether or not he is the Messiah, and Jesus offers very similar answers. In Luke, he says, "If I tell you, you will not believe." And in John, he says, "I told you, and you do not believe." Now, these are not referring to the same incident, because in Luke, this is happening during the Passion, after Jesus has already been arrested, while in John, it is occurring well before that. But in these answers, Jesus is essentially saying the same thing, that whether or not he tells the truth is irrelevant, because whatever he says will not be believed by the Jewish leaders, because they are not of his flock. Another parallel between Luke and John is very similar to this, and it again refers to incidents where Jesus is encountering skeptics. Now, I already mentioned the story of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man says to Abraham, "Send someone who comes back from the dead to my brothers so that they will not end up in hell like I have." Abraham says that they have Moses and the prophets, but the rich man responds and says it would be better if someone came from the dead. This they would believe without a doubt. But Abraham says that if they do not believe Moses, neither will they believe in someone who has risen from the dead. This is Jesus, in this parable, referring to himself. That if they don't believe what Moses said, then what Jesus says, they will not believe either, because Jesus is the fulfillment of Moses. In the Gospel of John, Jesus has encountered some skeptics, and he says to them that if you had believed Moses, you would have believed me, because he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? So there's this shared theme, I guess you could say. If you don't believe in Moses, you will not believe in Jesus either. Luke and John also are the only Gospels to mention Satan entering into Judas. In Luke, it is said that Satan entered into Judas, causing him to go to the chief priests and temple guards to figure out a plan to hand over Jesus. In John, Jesus gives the piece of dipped bread to Judas to signify that Judas will be the one to betray him. I actually made a short about this incident. And then John says that Satan entered into Judas when he received the piece of bread. Now, like Judas, Peter, in a sense, betrayed Jesus by denying knowing him 3 times, something that all 4 Gospels agree happened. But Luke and John are unique in that they both explain that Peter either is or will be restored after his denial. During the Last Supper, Jesus says to Peter, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat. But I've prayed that your own faith may not fail, and once you have turned back, you must strengthen your brothers." Jesus, of course, knew that Simon would betray him. He predicts that this will happen in all 4 Gospels. But he also says, once you have turned back, you must strengthen your brothers. And so Jesus is making it clear that in spite of the betrayal, Simon Peter will turn back to him. Likewise, in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, Jesus does indeed restore Simon Peter by asking him 3 times, "Simon, do you love me?" And Peter says yes each time. Another similarity between Luke and John is that Pontius Pilate tells the crowd 3 times that he finds Jesus innocent and not guilty of the crimes that they have accused him of. Both of them really strongly emphasize that Pilate's culpability for Jesus' death is far less when compared to the high priests, for example. Now, Matthew does this too, because he has the incident of Pilate washing his hands and saying that he is innocent of Jesus' blood, but he does not have 3 separate times where Pilate says that he finds Jesus not guilty. Another similarity is that Jesus is called the Son of Joseph as a title. This, interestingly, does not happen in Matthew, even though Matthew contains by far the most information about Joseph. Another somewhat minor parallel between Luke and John is that they both mention Simon Peter running to Jesus' tomb and seeing it empty after the women report that Jesus' body is gone. Now, John adds that the beloved disciple of Jesus also runs to the tomb with Peter, but both mention Peter running to the tomb and seeing that Jesus was not there. There are a couple of other similarities when looking at the resurrection narratives. For example, Luke and John both mention that Jesus ate bread and fish with his apostles after the resurrection. The fact that he ate with his apostles helps to establish the reality that he rose bodily from the dead, that it wasn't just a spiritual appearance. Likewise, Luke and John both share in mentioning that Jesus told his apostles to touch and see his wounds, to see that he had risen bodily. So both Luke and John really emphasizing that Jesus rose from the dead, body and soul, and that he wanted his apostles to understand this. The 16th and final parallel between Luke and John that I will share with you is that both of them kind of break the fourth wall. They both talk about their own purposes for writing the gospel within the gospel itself. The first 4 verses of Luke are a mini prologue where Luke talks about how he carefully investigated everything and wrote about it so that the recipient of his gospel, someone named Theophilus, will know whether or not what they have heard orally about Jesus is true. In chapter 20 of his gospel, John does something similar. John admits that beyond what he has written, Jesus did many other things, but that what he has written, he has done so in order that the reader might believe in Jesus and accept him as the Messiah and the Son of God. The end of John chapter 21 adds to this, saying that it is the beloved disciple who testified to the things that happened in the book and wrote them down. And it also says that Jesus did many other things, but if they were to all be described, the entire world would not be able to contain the books that would be written. Both Gospels include some brief remarks from the author related to the purposes behind their writing. So there you have it. 16 parallels between John and Luke. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video, and God bless.